Hello, everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for July 16th, 2020. And just reminding everybody of our code of conduct, please treat each other with respect and assume good intent. So with that, I think we have a short agenda. I did not rope anybody in for some project updates this week. So unless somebody's on there that wants to just give one, it's not on the agenda. But what is on the agenda is Mr. Krickenberg here.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a conformance light. I would either like to be able to share my screen, or I'd like to be able to confirm that people have taken a look at the Kubernetes profiles doc, because I'm just going to be talking against that doc. You could make me
go ahead. You can share now if you'd like.
Share away. Okay. Okay. So conformance profiles. To recap ever so slightly, conformance tests are what we use to validate that a Kubernetes is a Kubernetes. Today, conformance tests are written against a set of functionality that is expected to be non-optional, GA, standard, possible across all Kubernetes clusters everywhere. There has always been discussion about moving beyond that, though. The desire to validate functionality that is optional, that may not necessarily work across all clusters, but that would still help users validate that their workload will work as expected, regardless of which Kubernetes offering they use, so long as it passes a given set of conformance profiles. Conformance profiles have always been talked about in the discussion of not too many of them, and they've also been talked about in the context of let's make them additive only if at all possible, please, so that it's really obvious and intuitive that there's a base level of functionality that's always guaranteed, and then there is not that much additive stuff to avoid user fragmentation, so on and so forth. That you could think of some example profiles as being like storage, for example. Persistent storage isn't necessarily available out of the box, and you might not want persistent storage on some Kubernetes offerings that are intended to be like embedded or lightweight or edge focused, things of that nature. You could also, I'm just making these up, I'm not saying these are representative of what a profile could be. You could also say there might be a profile for like machine learning or something, where there's a certain set of hardware that's not going to be available by default everywhere. But if we were to have that hardware, it would be really great to ensure that Kubernetes exposes that in the appropriate way. Okay. Any questions about the background there?
I just will make a comment or two, if you don't mind, Aaron. One is that for this group to understand, the conformance actually is split into two things. There's what SIG architecture controls, which is sort of the specific process and tests that signify what Kubernetes is. But the CNCF runs a separate program to actually validate given vendors' distributions or managed offerings. And so this, what we do here is sort of within the scope of defining how profiles are done, but there's another aspect of getting profiles supported, which is getting the CNCF to revise their program. Now this, I think like 2 years ago, was already discussed with them, and there was an agreement made that this was a feasible thing, but just want to be sure people understand the difference between the responsibilities of the two groups. The second comment is that, and maybe this goes to Srinivas's second bullet point in the agenda, and maybe we'll talk about it then, but we do have to sort of figure out how we want to define profiles. The examples Aaron's given are to some extent around specific features like storage. If we do it by specific feature, we're going to end up with too many profiles, potentially, because there's so many different sets of features. So we want to figure out how to aggregate those into a smaller number of profiles that customers can understand. Um, uh, and those could be based on customer use cases, like say stateless, stateful, things like that, or could be uh, other suggestions have been, oh, there should be a cloud provider profile for that sort of has a whole lot of functionality that cloud providers, and an edge profile, which is also a kind of customer use case, but it's more about the deployment architecture than the types of workloads you run. So none of this is clear yet, but I just want in people's heads, and if people have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And then I think what Aaron's going to talk about more is the mechanisms which we use to identify tests as part of profiles. So that's all.
Yeah, John, I think you're spot on. That second bullet point that Trini and I have is more for that latter discussion, and we did not want to derail Aaron's discussion, which is more of a technical kind of thing. So just FYI.
Yep, I think that makes sense, and I appreciate us bifurcating that way. This is about the mechanical how, not necessarily the what.
Hey, John, this is Derek. It's okay. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
My parsing of your statement was that the CNCF would be the one defining the profile set?
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear there. We would define the profiles. What they would do is administer the program that says this particular distribution meets this profile, but really we provide all the tooling, and then the Sonobuoy team is the ones who've traditionally kind of built the tooling that is used by the vendors. So I may have caused more confusion than clarification with my statement. I apologize for.
I think that clarification aligns with what I would expect. I would expect Cube could define what profiles exist rather than allow an external party to declare the profile and then say we label as such. But thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and I know we talked about this early on, and I hadn't seen it, was like there's the thing of if we do the profiles, does anyone care? And is there incentive for people to actually bother with that? And so we should think at least about those elements of it at the meta level above where we're doing here. Like coming up with the profiles is great. If nobody cares about the profiles, they're just getting their CNCF trademark badge and they're done. We should ask ourselves, like, how do we loop that? How do we loop that back into our process?
I mean, okay, let's let Aaron finish, because I've got some thoughts about that, and let's just.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I just, again, want to walk through the logistics of how the project controls the definition of conformance today. So because we use a framework called Ginkgo to define our end-to-end tests, the only way we can currently select which tests to run or not run is by use of a regular expression applied against the test name. The system we've evolved within the project is to use tags. So in this case, a tag is a word in brackets. So we're using a tag conformance to denote that it's a conformance test. So you can run Ginkgo and focus on that tag, and you'll run the conformance tests. The way that we ensure that the appropriate set of people decide what is or is not a conformance test is we have a tool that sort of scrapes all of the test names, looking for those that have the word conformance in them, and compares that list against a known defined list that's checked into the Kubernetes repo. And so if they match, a specific set of people have to approve that up. Yeah, I think that covers that. So the requirements for defining profiles are we need to be able to specify which test belongs to which profiles in case it's a one-to-n mapping or one-to-one mapping. We should be able to restrict which tests are added to a given profile in the same way that we can restrict which tests are added to conformance. And we need to, since Sonobuoy is the tool that is used by the CNCF primarily for end-to-end test execution and verification, we need to be able to make sure that whatever results that Sonobuoy produces are sufficient to verify whether a given run of tests passes a given set of profiles. Those are the hard requirements. The nice to haves. I feel like it would be nice to be able to retroactively define profiles. the reason, so the example I'm going to give here is there's a sense that the set of tests that currently we call conformance may actually be may actually require like more privileges and more abilities than we actually expect to be available across all clusters. And so we may want to be able to retroactively say that what is currently the conformance test may actually look more like a base profile and then like a privileged profile or a cluster admin profile or other stuff on top of that. And it would be nice to say that people who passed the conformance tests against an already released version of Kubernetes would have the ability to say, actually, I passed the base profile and these additional profiles, because that's what the project has defined retroactively. To assist with this ability to define things retroactively, it would be really great to define these sort of hard-coded lists or whatever that we're looking against out of the Kubernetes tree. This is so we're not necessarily tied to the lifecycle of Kubernetes, and we're not necessarily tied to the pain that comes to contributing to the main Kubernetes tree at times. And it would also be nice to say that I only want to run a given set of tests for this profile or this other profile. So I'm going to jump ahead to what I call idea 0. I don't like this idea, but it's the most straightforward path. We continue to use like the conformance tag, and we add more tags for each profile. So we add a profile foo tag for each profile, and then to run tests, you can still focus on the conformance, or you could focus on the specific profile. We would continue to gate changes the exact same way. They would all land in a file inside of Kubernetes. The only way we would be able to retroactively define profiles is if we cherry pick these changes back. So it would be cherry picking test changes back and cherry picking data changes back. This would interact with Sonobuoy by requiring, it's not much of a change for Sonobuoy. You just update the E2E focus environment variable that Sonobuoy uses. So the pro is this is the most straightforward approach. It follows from what we do. The con is it's going to end up changing a lot of things as we change sort of the metadata about the test, like which test belongs to which profile. It's also going to make our test names even more illegible. I don't know how many people here really depend upon having all those tags live inside of the test name. So one thought we could do to mitigate the pain there is if we use the custom Ginkgo reporter to strip away all that extra noise. And so you see just sort of the straightforward test names, test grid in reports that say what it is, but we could still use the tags to select and focus against end-to-end tests. So this is the approach that most closely models today. I don't love it, but I also don't hate it just because it's what we have today. The option I feel that hits most of the nice to have requirements is to currently conformance tests parse a bunch of their information out of comments above the line of code that says conformance it. And so we would add another piece of information to that comment called profile. We would parse out of that. And then we would not actually add any additional tags or anything to the test names. So users would continue to run all the tests that have the tag conformance in them, but they may end up potentially running tests for a ton of profiles that they don't actually intend to pass. We would then sort of add an extra step to conformance validation, which is something that could be done by the CNCF or by the project, where given a set of test results, let's compare it against the profiles, and out the other side comes, you pass this profile, and this profile. We would define this as a new tool that the Kubernetes project provides. It would be written in a repo out of tree. And in that repo would also be the lists of all of the profiles. So in this way, we could define the profiles independent of the lifecycle of Kubernetes. Changes would be gated for review in the same way, like conformance tests would still have to go through the existing review process, but which profiles are allowed would be gated by a separate review process in the external repo. This would allow us to retroactively define profiles, so we could say what the base profile is for a given release, independent of the release cycle. This would require no additional interaction with Sonobuoy, but it would require additional post-processing of the results that Sonobuoy produces. The two cons of this approach are that there's no way to atomically write a single PR against the Kubernetes tree that both promotes a given enhancement to GA and also promotes the appropriate tests to conformance. But we feel like possibly that's okay. We're willing to live with the additional flexibility that benefits us. The other con is, of course, if I'm a vendor who's working on my offering and I really only want it to pass the storage profile and I don't care about the rest, it'd be great to run just the tests that make up the storage profile. So I have some additional suggestions on how we could hack up the E2E binary to support focusing on profiles using mechanisms that hijack what Ginkgo does. I'm not going to go into too many of the details there and just kind of stop and ask questions about what I've proposed so far.
Hi. Let me start with the first one, which is Sonobuoy, right? Sonobuoy kind of ended up in my larger team. So if things need to be done in Sonobuoy, please don't hesitate to have that as a blocker for the work that we are trying to do here. So that's one. The other one is the idea with the tags, right? Do we have to do profile colon base or whatever in the tags itself, or can we just say, here is the regex that you use for a specific profile, right? And then we are free to use whatever tags we want in the code itself, but then all we are publishing is, here is the regex for this profile. So that is one way to skin the cat as well. So you're not actually specifying the profile colon foo tag in the conformance. All you're saying is like, when you're running, here is the regex that you need to use. That is one way of, that could be something useful for previous releases. So that's one way of looking at it. The other one was,
I'm sorry, can I ask you, Srinivas, are you thinking that those would be then specific long regexes matching test names, or they would match feature tags? Or I guess I'm not clear on, I wouldn't want 1,000 member long regex passed to Ginkgo.
Yeah, that's a con, right? That it's
Okay.
like, it will be very long, and it could have like a whole bunch of things that, and it will be hard to update. And we can't guarantee that the test that we wanted actually ran, right? So that's probably why we need to lean towards the YAML one, for sure. Then the other one was E2E test. Currently, we do add the conformance YAML into the E2E.test. So if we need to make changes to, like, for multiple YAML files to be in there and then have a base and a foo and a bar, we can definitely do that. That should be trivial at this point to add more YAMLs. So that gives us a way to, E2E tests can spit out YAML that we embed as well. So people have a way to check, okay, this is the E2E.test, print me the base list of tests. It can do that. Today, it just prints whatever is in conformance.yaml, but then we can add a parameter there saying, okay, if you don't send any parameter, we can play around with the command line options. So not a problem. So And the other one is I'm like, it's a toss up between having a separate repository versus in-tree. The in-tree seems to be useful going forward, and I'm like not too sure, do we really need to go back and fix all the not fix, rather, do we need to, what is the specific need for defining profiles for things that have already shipped? I didn't understand the urgency.
I think that was, well, Aaron, I'll say something. Aaron might have a different opinion. I think that, there may be no need for that. But what we were thinking about was like, there may be existing distributions that say constrain certain APIs or like cluster administration or privilege pods or things like that, that currently aren't considered conformant because of that. And if we separate out those things, maybe those become conformant on a base profile, just not on a cluster administrator profile, that sort of thing. But granted, it's a problem that fixes itself within a year, right? So
exactly, right. Yeah, I would rather focus on going forward and do the right thing going forward, rather than worry about too much about like retrofitting existing stuff. That's my 2 cents there. I don't want to suddenly start people starting to claim that, oh, I wasn't conformant before, but I am conformant now. That kind of like sends mixed messages, I think.
I think it's more like, yeah, it's like things that aren't even released yet. If profiles don't go into effect until a certain time,
Right.
It is what it is.
Yeah. So given all that, then the only toss-up I have is between having the YAML files in the same repository versus another repository, and then the flip side of also is like, does the release team play into it? Do they need to can you put it in their repository instead of having one more repository? So that was only thing.
I think there's two general, just to recap, there's two general things. One is just added in the tags. The added in the tags, there's no new YAML files or anything, right? There's just existing conformance.yaml, and that's that. The other one is added in the test metadata, and rather than doing test selection, we do a post-processing. Even there doesn't need to be any new additional YAML files because it's in the test metadata already. It would just be copied to the same conformance.yaml. We post. So basically, the two things are just put a tag in the test name and do things as we do today, or don't bother with that since it messes up with test names and test grids and everything, and just post-process the logs and match things up afterward. That's kind of the two schemes.
Yeah, I'm like toss up. Either one is fine as long as we make progress.
Okay, and I think, yeah, your specific concerns are why I wanted to make sure I asked the broader audience here, because I don't feel like I've gotten sufficient feedback yet in just the conformance definition group, where I'm of the opinion where it would be nice to say, if we're going to roll out profiles as a concept, that you get them today, rather than you're going to have to wait until a later release to start segmenting profiles. Because it could be that we're going to be changing the definition of what conformance means today, and you get these additional profiles where you didn't have that with earlier versions. I could see it causing confusion, where it's like, well, I'm conformant on like Kubernetes 1.17, but like, what's this? What are all these other profiles? Like, can I say that I have that, or am I going to have to wait until I get to 120 to have that? I guess I don't hear a lot of people vocally pushing for that.
We don't hear a lot of opinions at all.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like my worry is we want to grow test coverage. Profiles are the way we'll do it. We'll do it, and then nobody will care about anything other than the base profile. And then we'll have a bunch of confusion that takes time away from it. Is the general goal of growing coverage under the conformance program worthwhile? Yes. Every new profile comes with some additional overhead in all of the outward stuff, because it is a new thing. It's like, well, today you're conformant or not, and you use that to get trademark or not, and that's it. Like, I don't know that the theory of conformance is we all get a warm fuzzy on the trademark if you satisfy this. The moment we have more than one, things get confused or complex, not confusing. And we'll need to manage that complexity with consumers. I think the goal of increasing our coverage of what it means to be Kubernetes is the right outcome. As we go down this, we'll have to be very careful about taking that feedback and not letting that overwhelm the process or making the process harder.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is like, there's the trademark piece, and that's the primary purpose it serves today. And then there's another question of like, from an actual functional user point of view, like, okay, can I move this workload from this Kubernetes distro to this other Kubernetes distro? And, or can I run this workload on this edge distribution when I've been running it in the cloud? And, that's like a bigger question that could evolve there eventually, where we know the profiles supported by individual clusters, and we know the profiles required by individual workloads, and we can make that sort of validation. That's a much that's a longer term thing that I'm not hearing huge demand for. But so I mean, we are focused on like, okay, let's make sure that storage works the same way across different vendors, and that's the target right now.
So far, the stuff that I've definitely heard is there are people who don't want to switch on privileged mode by default, right? In the default cluster thing. And then, but we insist that, it needs to be, the default needs to be privileged, only then you can pass the conformance, right? So that is one limitation we already have. So, so secure by default is definitely something that people struggle with. Some of the vendors want to be more secure than what the conformance currently provides, right? So that is definitely one aspect that we can tease out really quickly and say, look, if you want to be secure by default, then that's the base profile. And then if you want privilege, then and you want to do some special stuff, then that's the add-on, right? So that's definitely one feedback that we've heard so many times already. Other than that, I haven't really heard clamoring for like, okay, I've heard clamoring for like specific test suites for like CSI or CNI or things like that, but not with the conformance tests that we already have.
Yeah. But I think the spirit here of what Aaron was trying to do, and I don't want to put words in Aaron's mouth, is he was just trying to get the technical piece right to put us in a position to have all those wonderful, healthy conversations of things like, well, what are the equivalence classes? How many of the profiles do you put together and you call that the cloud provider one? And hey, who's on my team, right? And, and then, does it break up into, there's basically turned two equivalent classes, cloud provider and non-cloud provider. And I think what always happens, and I think this is happening to Aaron, is, Aaron's trying to figure out what is the best way so I can create these little profiles so that we can make progress from a testing point of view and say, we got a suite of tests for storage, we got a suite of tests for CR or whatever. And so I think we want to be a little bit careful to give him some freedom here, that if he can get some advice on the right way to do it, then we can go all have the really fun and useful conversation, which is, hey, how do we get all these folks to agree on what is the proper subsets for...
Understood, Brad. Aaron asked a specific question, which was what we were trying to answer, like who here is interested in what? So that was the feedback for that.
I do appreciate, I do think it's healthy to explore some of these things for me to help understand is my nice to have of being able to retroactively carve things up and define these too much complexity, or is it warranted given the secure by default profile scenario? I saw Derek had his hand up. and just posted
Yes,
it.
so thanks, Aaron. I was trying to correct my past interruption. So I want to make sure I understood your original question, though, which was the feedback we were prompting for, which was, my understanding was, if Kubernetes defines a new profile, Y, and is the definition of profile inherently tied to the release that that profile was first defined in? And so I thought your question was, if profile Y is declared in release X, must I be running release X in order to claim conformance on profile Y? And I thought my first reaction was that was very reasonable. And I want to make sure that that was your question.
That is my question. Like that's the way things are today. I'm asking, do we want to change that, or do we want to keep it that way?
Yeah, so I would be +1 on that. That seemed entirely appropriate, that the release would be tied, or the profile definition would be tied to the release that was first tested on, rather than taking on work to test it in back releases.
I think yeah, in that context, that makes sense. I think the only place that and this is why I said it fixes itself after a year, like the only place is decomposing the existing conformance suite into multiple profiles. Are there distributions who would like to be able to claim, oh, I am now conformant because I'm conformant to the base profile, because before I didn't allow certain privileged operations, and so I couldn't be considered conformant. That would be the only, and that fixes itself, right? So it would be that initial decomposition of the current conformance suite would be the only time this would be relevant, I would think.
And so Derek's question is, wouldn't it require cherry picks prior to previous releases to do this? And that's why I was proposing there's an option where the answer is no if we define the lists completely out of tree. So we would still like lock the lists to a version, but we wouldn't like cherry pick anything around in Kubernetes.
Yeah, and my response to that was like, let's not design for that case, but let's design for now for going forward, which will make it easier on us right now, because this profile thing we are just starting to explore. Why try to design it in such a way that we are going backwards? That was my question.
Okay. Derek, your hand is still up. I don't know if you had more to say.
Apologies, Aaron. I will take my hand down.
That's all good. Just one concrete example I'll give of retroactive adjustment of conformance. So we were approached by Michelle from SIG Storage about, it turns out the conformance tests were exercising a piece of storage functionality that was actually a bug. Like the conformance tests were verifying something was happening that shouldn't be allowed to happen. And so we proposed the idea of, we're going to remove those conformance tests that are verifying this bug can happen from earlier releases of Kubernetes. So this is cherry picking back. It is changing the definition of conformance for earlier releases of Kubernetes, but it's lowering the bar. It's not raising the bar for anything. And then it's up to us going forward whether we want to write negative tests that verify that that bug can no longer happen. So like I can see the case being made that like we already kind of, the definition of conformance for a given version changes, but it's done right now via cherry picks.
I mean, if it's a bug and it's broken and it's important enough and it's in conformance, either that condition doesn't belong in conformance, or it's just something that, like, I do think that if people are running conformance off of like tagged versions, there's like a bunch of stuff is like the conformance definition will never be complete. And so the reason so it's weird because like from a test perspective, of course we cherry pick those fixes to verify the bug is fixed. Conformance to get a trademark, no one is going back and rerunning their conformance tests to re-get trademarks on 116 because the process doesn't require it. And so for the primary consumer of conformance today, which is getting a trademark, no one cares. Once they have it, they ignore that branch forever. The CNCF doesn't require rerunning. People should, but like, I mean,
But
so
it
I
does
think there's no,
Yeah, it can only,
go ahead.
it can only come up if somebody tried to replicate it, but then I think it would be clear to just say, hey, yeah, that test shouldn't still be in there, right? You should use it. Right?
It falls in the exception scenario of like, we can get 99.9. I'd rather have the fixed test in the code and backported. And I think this is that tension, Aaron, of our goal is to have good test coverage and to ensure stuff works. The human process around certification, if it causes a tiny bit more friction there, it feels like the right place to have a little bit more friction because it's already a place that's somewhat, it's not an automated process.
And the other thing is like, then there'll be people who will want to, okay, I'm going to try the new base profile that you have defined. And then it's the question of, okay, which version of Sonoboy did you use? Which version of E2E conformance container image did you use? And then what did you use to parse the list of tests? It's going to be a nightmare for people.
So I'll put my hat on right now. And like, that's a problem too of like,
right.
There is what's in Kubernetes. Sonobui is not part of that. And this is a challenge. Like we're fine with that today. And you don't have to run it that way. Like we don't enforce it. It's a convenient way to do it. I feel like the Sonobui project, that's something they could communicate and add value that way. And that is a benefit to the ecosystem to have, like that is a place where Sonobui not being part of KK actually is a benefit because
it's tied in a lot closer than it used to be. It actually uses an image that is cut as a release artifact as part of KK. DIMS helps do that.
Exactly. That's the point.
But that's cube code. That's what I mean. Is like Sonobui is an experience around running that. That's fine.
Right.
Okay.
So we have to retrofit the tool to say, okay, even though you're running against 1.6, you need to get the E2E test from 1.9, and then you have to pull the YAML file.
If tests are broken and we backport a fix that would break the tests, we should also backport the fix. The head of a branch is truth, like kube source is truth for conformance. And so if we backport a fix, we backport the test fix, and head of the branch is truth, and tools need to, truth is a source code. And then we want the projects and processes around it to be like, oh, just rerun, or do you have this fix applied? And it's going to be ugly, but I think it's better to be correct in this case than to discourage, trying to keep those things close to their upstreams.
Okay. So to recap what I have heard, it sounds like we want to keep it in tree, and we don't want to allow retroactively defining things. And we are indifferent whether we do that with more tags or whether we try to be clever with our use of YAML files. The only other comment I'll make on the YAML file thing is, like, I'm so thankful you added that, DIMS. It is like yet another addition to our Rube Goldberg machine that is defining all this stuff. It's only landed in 118, so it can't be used retroactively for versions of 116, 117. And part of my proposal here was to offer a tool or a service that allows the CNCF to benefit from defining that, using something like that YAML file retroactively. Because I think today, the way they verify conformance, verify conformance test runs is like they look at the number of tests that say passed. They don't actually verify the names of the tests, that the set of tests that ran is the expected set of tests. And so I think it'd be really helpful to help them validate that by embedding that YAML file in 118. We can do that going forward. I think it would be useful to figure out how to do that for previous releases of Kubernetes as well. But, I can work with you on the details of that offline if nobody else here is interested in that.
Okay, so it sounds like decision-wise, Aaron, are you thinking, I know when you talked to the testing team, it was, they thought just labels, tags, so should we just go with tags?
Yeah, just tags is what is the feedback I've gotten in shopping this around so far. I feel like it's gonna cause more pain on the release team, but I will help work through that with them.
Okay.
Thank you for your time on that.
Actually, I have a comment on that. Can we, right now we wrap it with the and if the number of profiles are limited, we still can control that using similar wrap of the function itself. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think you broke up a little bit there, but I think that if you look at what Aaron's proposing, we would use that same wrapper to specify the profiles.
Right. I understand. Yeah. That means the conformance 8 block is going to contain the information. Rather than that, I would say profile 8, profile 1.8 or profile 2.8, that kind of stuff. So we keep wrapping for the number of profiles we have. So we just can run those blocks rather than have to deal with the regex or something like that.
Yeah. So the way I'm thinking of it, Srinivas, is just conformance. It will take a list of profile names, and it could be empty, which is the base profile. Something like that.
It's definitely a possible approach. I didn't want to constrain folks who are interested in defining what the profiles are to saying one test can only belong to one profile. It could be that you find you want the ability to define one test going into different profiles if they're more like use case focused profiles as opposed to capability specific profiles.
That makes sense.
All right. Thank you all for your time. I apologize for taking up so much of it.
Yeah, that's great. Let's get it.
We made so much progress, Aaron. What are you talking about?
Exactly. An actual decision. So it sounds like Brad had to drop off. Srini, do you want to go on to your bullet point? Do you want to wait for next time? It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm basically, yep, you're right. I mean, Brad has some ideas around this, and probably we should wait for the next week. That would make sense. But general idea is this, and Aaron linked another kept there. So we're looking at figuring out what the process on how we, from the technical point of view, define these profiles, or so that there is some kind of convergence among various cloud providers. So definitely we can take it out next week if that is possible. Next time.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I lost my agenda tab here. I think that was the last thing on our agenda. Is there anybody who wants to give an update on any of the sub-projects before we drop off, because we have 12 minutes left? If not, still lost my agenda. Happy to end early.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, and it's almost the weekend, so enjoy your weekend. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Stay healthy. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That's all. Happy Thursday.